Okay, thanks, Kat. Pat, I'm going to share my screen. Give me a thumbs up if when you see the screen, so I know that we're good. Yeah, we're good. Okay, so I'm going to talk.
Steve, real quick, we can see your screen, but all we can see is a Zoom window. Is that
Okay.
what you want us to see?
No.
Okay.
Try again. I have too many choices. Let's try this one. Is it?
Yeah, that's the right one. Yep,
okay,
perfect.
Thanks. I always have to ask because it never seems to go as I think it should. So I want to talk a little bit about, or a bit about this decision-making process. Fairly simple, but really useful. I use it all the time. I teach it in my negotiation courses, my decision analysis courses, and I use it primarily in group problem solving, but it's really designed for both, for unitary decision making as an individual or working with a group trying to make some decisions together. And let me make sure we're going to go. So the idea here is, we make decisions all the time, right? And for the most part, we do pretty well. But then, when problems become, really important and critical that we make the right decision, sometimes we freeze up. We just don't have an approach, a systematic approach to making really tough choices. What we often sort of defer to is a fairly simplistic approach, basically based on these two questions. We typically ask, what are my alternatives? And then which alternative is best? And we rely on that. And for most simple problems, that's fine. But I think we need to go beyond that. And so I'll talk to you about sort of this different approach. And I'm going to give an example of how I've used it for a personal decision. And then if we have some time, I'll talk about sort of how you might use this with other people. So this comes from this nice little book called Smart Choices. And I picked this up about 12 or 13 years ago. And it really just changed the way that I approached problem solving in my work. It's by John Hammond, Ralph Keeney, Howard Reifa. And these guys are, Reifa's a mathematician. So Keeney is sort of like a mathematician guy. But it's very simplified. And it's sort of all the things that you might have learned about decision-making in different courses. This is for me anyway, I'm an economist, sort of in this one simple text. So pick it up if you have a chance. So there are 4 elements to this decision roadmap. A good decision roadmap. First, it focuses on what's important. So you want a process that's going to help you focus on those things that are important to you. Second, it's logical and consistent, meaning that you apply it to one problem, it'll work on different problems, right? So it's very handy as well as logical. You can kind of see this logic as I play through it. It requires only as much information and analysis as is necessary, which is important. We tend to get tied into a lot of, sort of sorting through the data in situations when we really don't need to. And we can use this process in such a way that we can eliminate a lot of the data and analysis as we move through it. And it's straightforward, reliable, easy to use, and flexible. Okay, so it's called PrOACT, and the letters stand for PR is defining the problem, specifying our objectives, and I'll cover each of these in turn. That's O. We want to list alternatives. Then we're going to consider the consequences of choosing any particular alternative. And then we need to make trade-offs, right, between our choices. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of how we think about those trade-offs. We also need to be cognizant of and dealing with, how we deal with uncertainty. So that's kind of wrapped into here, as well as our own risk preference or tolerance for risk. That's also wrapped in, but I won't talk about those two things. So problems, okay? So, we tend to think, oh, we know what the problem is, of course. And oftentimes problems are caused by some triggering, or problems are brought to us, or we can also call them decision opportunities, are brought to us by some triggering event. And we typically link that triggering event directly to the problem before us, okay? Without really stepping back and thinking, oh, no, wait, maybe this problem is a little bit bigger than what I thought it was. And we also make some assumptions about what that problem is. We assume a lot of things away right away. And it's just a matter of our own heuristics of we're trying to simplify things as quickly as we can. And in the problem development stage or problem identification stage, you really have to avoid that, okay? So a good example, and I used this process when I was deciding whether or not I was going to come to the University of Wyoming, where I was going to take a job at the University of Wyoming. And the problem that I thought it was, do I go to Wyoming or do I stay at North Carolina State? Because that seemed like the obvious choices that I had. But really, when I started to think about it and rethinking what my problem really was, it was the decision opportunity of what do I want to do with my career? By stating it that way, it changed the whole situation for me, right? Because it made me think about other alternatives than just Wyoming or my current work where I was. And that actually led me down the path to start negotiating with another college at North Carolina State that I thought, oh, I could probably do better in that college than where I was currently. So now I had new opportunities I hadn't really considered, just by reframing it in that way. The second element is objectives. This is critical, okay? So if you get your objectives right, and that is what's important to you. What is it that really is like, you've got to be able to accomplish X in order for this thing to work. And when you're thinking about objectives, what you want to do is you get to what's called fundamental objectives. And that's really the sort of the motivating objectives that are sort of making things very clear for you. We tend to, so an objective might be, so my objectives for making these choices about whether to come to the University of Wyoming were, I wanted an opportunity where I could expand the work that I was doing. I felt that I was bumping into some barriers, and I wanted a bit more freedom than what I had. I also wanted a place to work where there were resources that would provide me with those opportunities. So these are fairly fundamental objectives, right? I wasn't saying I want to come to Wyoming or I want to come to the West. It was much more fundamental than that. So what was important to me was, I wanted to work in an environment where my skills and abilities were appreciated. I wanted to teach others some of the stuff that I was involved in. I wanted to keep my spouse happy. So those were some things that I was making sure as I was thinking about my choices, what would work here. Okay, after objectives is alternatives. And this is where we generally excel in problem solving. If we can consider a wide range of alternatives, that's great. And it's something that we're, as problem solvers, natural problem solvers, it's kind of what we do, right? Well, you could do this or you could do that. You get advice all the time from people who are helping you try to solve your problem. You're going, no, I don't want to do those things because my objectives tell me something different, okay? But the alternatives are important. And really what we're trying to do is, that's how we sort of identify, how we're going to meet our objectives. So it's, if we have objectives, then what are the alternatives that get us to meet those objectives, okay? So we want to ask how and brainstorm. And typically the objectives and alternatives sometimes run into one another. They're almost the same sometimes. And that's because we can consider some of those alternatives as really primary fundamental objectives as well. After alternatives, we brainstorm alternatives. Then what we need to be doing is describing the consequences of making our choices, right? And this is where, this is where we can use modeling techniques. You can go pretty far in this direction if you want. First and foremost, the way to evaluate alternatives is basically how well do they satisfy your objectives, number one, okay? So what we're gonna always do is think about, okay, if I go to choice A, is my spouse gonna be happy? Am I gonna get the resources I need, etc. So that's step one, is evaluate your alternatives based on how well they satisfy your objectives. We also have other consequences that are not associated with our objectives typically. And these are like, is it legal? Is it gonna, if I make this choice, am I gonna end up in jail or not? Is it doable? Is it, do I have enough money to do that? So they're separated from our objectives, but we typically use those types of criteria as well. And then when we're doing something in a group, a third criterion that typically comes into play is it fair? Okay. If we make a choice, how does that affect the other people in my group? Okay. So how well is, our consequences is how well do these alternatives satisfy our objectives? Number two is those sort of hard criteria. Is it legal? Is it cost effective, et cetera? And the third is, if we're in a group, is it fair? And then lastly, and I don't know what happened to my T, there it is, trade-offs. So because, we're gonna make choices that sort of get some of our objectives, but not all of our objectives, we're gonna have to make those trade-offs. And so you're gonna have to give up one thing to gain something else, such as life. It's like, that's how we normally operate. One of the things that you want to do, though, when you're thinking about trade-offs, is you're basically trading off what objective you're going to meet or not. So again, objectives are primary. If we have a clear understanding of what those things are, right? I want to keep my spouse happy. I want to be rewarded for the things that I do and do well. I want to work in a place where, people are collegial, etc. Then I can start to say, okay, well, I'm not going to get the collegial atmosphere at choice B, but I'll get these other things. So that's the trade-off I'm going to make. But I can't move without making my spouse happy. So that's primary objective number one. And I can tell you a little story about how that all happened. She didn't really want to come to Wyoming, but I built her a studio. That's what happened. So remember, so it's basically PrOACT, PrOACT. And we follow that in sort of stepwise approach, okay? I'm gonna bring up just a couple of things. Have I got time, Andy? 2 minutes? Okay, so if you're doing this in a group, here's some things to consider. Number one is, we're working in what we call problem space, and we're also working in solution space. So we're defining the problem, we're finding solutions, right? So in problem space, we can think about it as we're going to get started, we're going to learn about the problem, and there we're engaging in divergent thinking. I have an idea of what the problem is, you have a different idea of what the problem is. We're going to have divergent thinking occur in which we're going to, sort of learn from one another. And our thinking is diverging. We're going to end up in a place called the groan zone, where we're trying to define the problem, because all of a sudden I thought I knew what the problem was, now I don't. And oftentimes this is a place in which we're working with a group and people are feeling like we're not getting anywhere, right? Because I came in, I knew what the problem is, now I don't know what the problem is, and all we're doing is messing around trying to figure out what this problem is. And so we have to get past that groan zone and move into converging on a common definition of what we're trying to solve together, okay? So we're converging then again on a common definition. And then we're gonna do the same thing in solution space, okay? We've defined the problem. Then we're gonna generate alternatives, that's divergent thinking, right? Brainstorming, all that stuff that we do well. We're gonna evaluate those consequences. That's sometimes very difficult because you know, your choice, the thing that you'd like to do doesn't really work for me. And we're gonna have to have words about this and figure this out. And then what we're gonna do is though, start to make some trade-offs, okay? And converge again on a common solution. And reach agreement, okay? So think about that double diamond as your problem solving. Divergent thinking, convergent thinking, diverging, converging. And you're always going to be faced with this groan zone in the middle. One last slide, and that is, if you're familiar with this, what's called the Tuckman model of forming, storming, norming, performing, right? What's happening is the group is improving its performance, but where are you in the problem definition phase, identifying objectives, generating alternatives, evaluating consequences, and making trade-offs? When you're defining the problem, the group is not performing, right? You're just getting together. This is really difficult. And this is where a lot of processes just fall off the cliff, right? Because people are saying, my God, we're not getting anywhere. I thought I knew what the problem is. I can't convince the people that this is a problem. And I'm just out of here. Okay, so you got to stick with it. So as your group performs, you'll be able to sort of move across this process. And that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing. And if you have any questions or I'll let Pat, you can take over.
Thank you, Steve. That was amazing. As soon as you said the book, I was like, oh shoot, I have that in my bookshelf and I've never even opened it. And now you just saved me 3 hours. I really appreciate that. Really great layout. Does anybody have any questions for Steve before we get into groups?